Why does it look like my rear main seal and front crank seal are both leaking coolant? Welcome back to the laboratory. We're working on the Mustang again. In a previous video, you might have heard me mention that I was pissed off at it. Well, reason is a couple things. One, it was making some kind of weird noise either from the transmission or the clutch, so as you just saw, all the clutch and transmission is out of it again. Try and figure out what's going on there. The other problem is that it sprung a leak. It's leaking coolant, but it's leaking it from the middle of the back of the engine. It's like it was leaking out of the rear main seal, but it's coolant, it's not oil. And the weird thing is, small block Fords don't have any freeze plugs at the back of the engine. Like there's nothing on the back of the block that should be leaking like that. From what I can tell from up top, and I've had the upper intake off and I've looked around at the back and I can't really find any obvious leaks from the intake, but it doesn't look like it's coming from the heads, it doesn't look like it's coming from the back of the intake. For whatever reason, it's dripping out of the middle of the back of the engine and I just don't understand why. So we're going to take the flywheel off, we're going to take the block saver part of the scatter shield off, I'm going to repressurize the cooling system, and we're going to try and see if we can figure out where it's leaking. Hopefully it's not a cracked block. This leak just came out of nowhere. The car, sat here most of last winter waiting for me to get the transmission parts so I could put the trans back together. Didn't leak a drop. Put the trans back in, fire the thing up for 30 seconds, and all of a sudden it's leaking water out of the back of the engine for no good reason. I pressurized the cooling system. It holds pressure for days, but at the same time it leaks too, so it's not a big leak. And when I pressurized the cooling system, well, I sprung another leak at the front of the engine too, which you just saw. So besides figuring out what's going on at the back of the engine, we got to figure out what's going on at the front of the engine too. So I got some new water pump gaskets on order. None of them were in stock anywhere in the city, so I've got to wait for them to come in. But we'll tear that apart and we'll look and see what we can figure out at the back of the engine. So let's get underneath this thing and let's see what we can find out at the back.
I'm telling you, baby, that's not mine.
So here's what we found. You can see the drip at the bottom of the back of the oil pan. And if you look close, you can see it's coming from this side of the rail and then running down and then dripping there. And it's running down the entire length of the rail, so it's coming from the front. And at the front, you may or may not be able to see this on the camera, but it's leaking from the water pump. And it's leaking down onto the pan rail, which again runs to the back. So there we go. The mystery leak is coming from the water pump. So we're going to put some new water pump gaskets in there. I'm not going to bore you with all of that video because I've done that twice already, so you can go back and watch the previous videos on that if you're really interested. If you really want to see me swap water pumps, well, I got a couple of videos in the past where I did exactly that, so I'm not going to repeat all of that again here. However, I do need to reseal the leaking water pump, so I need to put some new gaskets in there, so I need to pull that water pump off, which means I need to drain the coolant out. And I need to pull the alternator off to get the water pump off. So if I got to pull the alternator off, well, I might as well replace it with a 100 amp shiny new alternator, because that old alternator was struggling to try and keep up with electric fans, electric water pumps, headlights, windshield wipers, all of that stuff. And if I got to dump the coolant out, well, if you've been watching my old videos, you know that I've got a bit of an overheating problem. So if the coolant's coming out, well, then I might as well install a shiny new aluminum heavy-duty radiator. So let's get after that stuff. Well, that escalated quickly. Turns out when I had my head in there dealing with the water pump, I saw some evidence of coolant leaking from the front of the intake manifold on the passenger side here too. So as promised, I didn't bore you with taking off the water pump, but I bored you now with pulling off the intake manifold. So we're going to reseal that, put new gaskets in, reseal that, try and get the intake to stop leaking, do all of the water pump stuff off camera, because again, previous video is not going to re-bore you with that stuff. Try and get the water pump from not leaking and put this stuff all back together again. Now, you may have noticed also that I took the old shroud off the old rad and put it on the new rad, and you might be thinking I'm insane for doing something like that. And, well, the reason I did it was that was just the easiest way for me to accommodate having a mount for the coolant overflow catch can. In the future, I'll make something more elaborate, and maybe I can take the shroud off at that point and save a couple more pounds. I don't think the shroud is going to really hurt anything, but we'll see. At highway speeds, it might end up being a restriction to the airflow. So if I can pull the shroud off and get a bit more flow at highway speed, then that's a bonus. But in the meantime, this was just a shortcut for me to mount that bottle. So we're going to get it all back together, and hopefully it's not going to leak. We'll see. I'm not going to bore you with the entire reinstallation of the intake manifold, but I wanted to point out a couple of things. One of the things I love about the Fords is that the intake manifold bolts go in perfectly vertically. So to really make it easy to drop the intake back on, you can just take some bolts, cut the heads off them, and put 4 studs in the corner, and then you can line the intake up on the studs and drop it straight into place without disturbing the gasket. The other thing I wanted to point out is that there's different gaskets. This is the Felpro 1262. What I had on here before was a 1262 S3, and there's a bit of a difference in them. These gaskets have the tabs here that interlock with the head gaskets, and I had to trim those to get the ports to align properly this way. Now I'm going to end up having to cut them right off because the ports don't align in the vertical direction. It's too low. So instead of just taking gaskets, throwing them on, dropping the intake on, you need to look at this stuff and check these things always. The other obvious thing is the water passage in the front here is not a good match for what's on the head or what's on the intake manifold, because these gaskets are made for Windsors and a whole bunch of other things. They're trying to be more universal. So I've taken some black felt and I've outlined where the opening is going to be when I trim it. So I'm going to make sure that I've got a nice coat of RTV around the backside. These are the Printo-Seal ones. They've got the RTV printed right into the gasket, but only on one side, not on the backside. So we're going to make sure that we get RTV on the backside to try and seal up the coolant passages. On the other side here, this is going to have to be trimmed back because it's actually cutting off quite a bit of the port, so it's going to impede quite a bit of the coolant flow here. So I can't pull the gasket any further this way because then the intake ports won't align. So I've got to trim this opening bigger, and we're going to end up probably slopping RTV on both sides of this by the time we're done. So wanted to point that out. So we're going to get to doing that, drop the intake on, hopefully everything seals up. All right, we've got it all back together again. The intake's all back on and buttoned up. New water pump is on. While I was at it, I put in the new alternator, and we've got the shiny new radiator in there as well. I let everything sit overnight so that the RTV could fully cure, then filled it up full of coolant, pressurized the system, and let that sit for 24 hours and look for leaks. So we dropped a few PSI overnight, and we've got some new leaks. So we've got a new leak at the back of the engine. It's coming from the back of the intake manifold on the passenger side. We've also got a new leak on the front of the engine from the intake manifold again on the passenger side. So until I get the transmission and clutch back in there, I can't really fire the engine up and heat cycle it and retorque the intake, but that's going to be my plan. We didn't lose all of the pressure. So it's leaking slowly. If I run it through a heat cycle, I'll try and go back and retorque everything and then repressurize it and see if it'll hold pressure and hold coolant. But one thing is absolutely clear, this car hates me. This engine and transmission never leaked a drop for a year, and now it won't not leak. And the same thing with the transmission. This is driving me crazy because pulling the intake off of this thing is a pretty involved job. And I don't want to be doing it over and over and over again. Anyway, we're going to leave this video here. As usual, I don't edit out the fail. And as usual on this channel, there's lots of fail. So here's more. Mystery leak was found. Mystery leak was fixed. Mystery leak fix resulted in 2 new leaks that are even worse. We'll call that a fail. Thanks for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, share with your friends, and remember, be kind and be humble. We'll see you on the next one. Editing. editing saves my life. What was I saying?